I'll try to be quick because I'd like to raise more than one point on the issues and the pitfalls of scientific reporting and health reporting during the pandemic, but not only during the pandemic. First of all, we always think that scientific and health reporting deals with reporting data and numbers. And we think that a scientific reporter and a health reporter is someone who mines the data, who finds the data and bring them to the public. This is this is an important part of the job because we know that there are a lot of campaigns and useful campaigns in order to open access to the data, and this is very important. But it's also a quite naive part of the point of view on the job of a science and health reporter, because data do not simply exist. Data are produced. This is a quotation from Alexis Madrigal, which is a science reporter from the Atlantic in the US, and I think it's very. He raises an important point. The data are not just there. The data are produced through a human process, which is which suffers from biases, individual, economical, societal, and cultural. And so you don't have just to bring the data to the public, but also to know how the data was created. All data, in some sense, are an artifact, in the sense that they are produced in some condition, and you have to know the condition in order to interpret and analyze the data. So we do not just convey numbers to people, but we also have to know how numbers are produced, and this is not always easy. Second point, infectious diseases and epidemiology and pandemics deals with not only scientific and health events, but with global societal events. And so it is important to have scientific skills and background to report them, but they are not enough. I think that the best job made during the pandemics was not made by scientific reporters or reporters with scientific background, but by reporters who could integrate both sides. Because you need, of course, to know how a virus works, for example, but you also have to know how the virus evolves in society, and you have to know which driving force brings people in contact, so you have to know how labor work, how economic work, how transport network work. You have to know a bunch of information about the society as a whole, which sometimes are more present in traditional reporters and sometimes lack in scientific reporters. So you have to integrate both skills in order to report correctly on this kind of event. Third issue, and I think, please stop me if I go too long. Finding reliable sources has become more difficult. Even before the pandemic, we know that, for example, traditional peer-reviewed journals were in crisis, I would say. The title peer review is broken. If you look on Google on the title peer review is broken, you will find dozens of articles saying that. And I think that during the pandemic, this has just become clearer to all of us. This is a problem because some year ago, an accurate science reporter, health reporter, was someone who stick to credible journals, credible information, peer-reviewed information. Now, this is not enough. You have to take into account that something which is published on The Lancet is not always more accurate than something which you read on Twitter, for example. The example of the hydroxychloroquine, I think, is very telling on this. The hydroxychloroquine was, they started to use it on the basis of false peer-reviewed research, and we stop using it on the basis on another false peer-reviewed literature. So, so finding more reliable sources, finding reliable sources has become more different. You have to look at gray literature. You have to know how to read gray literature, which is scientific report, which is not peer review and do not grow through the traditional scientific process of publication. You have to know how a social network works, for example. Twitter during the pandemic has been a very relevant source of information. I don't like social network. I would like to quit them, but you cannot actually do without Twitter during the pandemic. I hope it will stop also to go out from Twitter. And another point deals with the data and the numbers, which are a very delicate piece of information to convey. People with a scientific background, I'm a physicist, my scientific background is of a theoretical physicist. We tend to think that giving numbers in an article helps the reader, because telling big or small doesn't mean so much. Telling a vaccine is 60%, has an efficacy of 60% is something more clear that I can judge. This is not true for the general audience, because very few people understand correctly percentage. So when you say the vaccine efficacy is 60%, most of the readers think this is not something I can understand. And if you say, well, this is not 60%, actually the confidence interval is between 40 and 80%, which is something very realistic, people with scientific background is even happier, because you know, it's not just 60, it's from 40 to 80. I know maybe something more on the issue. A general reader will be completely confused, because if you say that a vaccine has an efficacy between 40 and 80%, I mean, a usual journalist on a newspaper will have to add a comment on that. So you will say, which is a very huge efficacy, or it's a very low efficacy. And finally, you have given 3 numbers, but the only thing that counts, that really counts, is my judgment on the efficacy. So it's a human biased information. And even if you have used numbers, the only thing that remains to the reader is the judgment. So numbers can be very democratic, because everybody can judge them and analyze them, but can also become very, how to say, can be exclude most of the public from the public discussion. The last point I would like to raise deals with our profession, which has changed in the last years. Until 20 or 30 years ago, a scientific and health reporter was first of all a journalist. For example, some month ago we lost Piero Angela, which was the most important scientific communicator in Italy for decades, and maybe even one of the most relevant science communicator on the international level. Well, he didn't have a scientific background. He didn't have a degree. He was, first of all, a journalist, and just in one part of his career, he became a science communicator. Nowadays, most of the scientific communicators, myself, among them, are people with a scientific background and sometimes with an academic background, which give us maybe some skills when analyzing data, some skill when reading a paper, but makes also us embedded journalists. Because sometimes we are too much on the side of the scientist when we tell something to the public. I don't want to be nostalgic. I don't think that before the old times are better than nowadays. But this is a change that has to be taken into account. We try most of the time to give the point of view of the scientist instead of making the question that the general audience would make to the scientist. This is a fact, but this has become a problem because in the last years, the context, the environment has changed. The scientific community, we like it or not, is part of an elite. And in the last years, the discontent and against the elite has become one of the most important driving forces into politics and society as a whole, from the US to China to Italy. And being an embedded journalist in an environment who is changing and has to follow a little bit, because media are also a market, and has to follow an anti-elite discontent and anti-elite sentiment has become more and more difficult. And to be both of this strange job has become more and more difficult, and I think that is something that the media as a whole has to face and has to try to tackle in the following years.
First of all, what should a journalist who has to write a science news do? Let's take the analysis presented by Camilla as an example. If a journalist wants to write a good news from that study, for example, what should he has to do? So, find a story, get the paper, read and understand methods and results, read editorials and commentaries, read related scientific literature, speak with one of a couple of experts, and more, and then finally write the story. So, obviously, we are talking about what you should do to be really good at it, and then you don't always have to do all these things to write a decent article. But if a journalist wants to do all these things, how much time he needs? In these days, I talked with a few colleagues about this, and the average answer was 2 or 3 days of work. Several models exist to calculate how much a freelancer should be charged for his work. And in one of them, che era sulla slide, the author tried to estimate the cost by making a comparison with hired employees. Taking an average employee's salary, he calculated that days of work by a freelancer is worth about 170 euros. If a journalist takes 2 days of work to write a good science news, he should charge about 340 euros. But do you know how much newspaper pays freelance writers? Yes. Let's talk about online newspaper. On Sunday, the Italian newspaper Il Post sent out a newsletter about the future of newspaper and journalism called Charlie. And they did a small survey about on how much freelance contributors are paid by major Italian newspaper. Corriere.it pays 15 euros for a news. Repubblica.it from 10 to 50 euros. La Stampa 20 euros. 20 euros. Il Fatto Quotidiano from 30 to 50 euros. Il Foglio pay a little more, from 60 to 90s. Il Messaggero.it 7 euros for an article. So in some cases, in order to survive, a freelance science journalist has to write dozens of articles a week, and he doesn't have time to do better his work. Of course, these are salaries of freelance journalists, but the number of professional journalists hired as employees is decreasing every year, while the number of freelance journalists is increasing exponentially. And in addition to what they charge for their job, the cost to access scientific sources should also be taken into account, because only a portion of the studies conducted internationally are supported by public funding. And most are supported by sponsorship from private companies, and very often it's this part of clinical research that is promoted through the media. Studies that are not publicly funding are not among those for which institutions require open access to data. And for this reason, even journalists must purchase access to articles or subscription to academic journals. And it's also important to note that even when articles are freely accessible on journal websites, the same cannot be said for editorials and commentaries that usually explain to the readers and also to the journalists the qualities of the studies, but also the limitations. Among the skills that a science journalist must have is to build a representation of their readers and adapt the quality and quantity of information. But how to do that? Until a few years ago, one of the tricks journalists used was to look at the advertisement of the newspapers they were writing for. Today, thanks to social media, it's possible to establish a dialogue with the readers and learning about their skills and needs. But I think it's a widespread idea that in transferring scientific concepts to a generalist audience, the best approach is less is more. So few concepts, but explained clearly. But I think that even this approach conceals a certain amount of paternalism. So the journalist decides what information the reader can handle and translate it into language he thinks the reader can understand. So I think that the approach suggested by Edward Tufte, who is a statistician and one of the world's leading experts on infographics, could be more correct. He says that the goal should not be to select a few things and communicate them in a simple way, but to find the best way to communicate the greatest amount of information in the most understandable way. In other words, you have to eliminate all the attributes that disturb the understanding of the data and not the data itself. Another pitfall that science journalists often fall into is authority bias. This mechanism relies on the involvement of one or more experts whose opinion is often considered of equal importance to the evidence, or even more important. But how do you decide that an expert or journal is trustworthy? And how do you relate to the sources they deem reliable? And more, if you interview, for example, a Nobel Prize on the topic for which he won the prize, then do you verify if everything he told you is correct? So I think that in Italy, the role of science journalists has historically been under-recognized, with few science journalists in newsrooms and little dedicated course available. And we saw this during the 19 pandemic, with many journalists having to start writing about health despite having no specific training in this field. And I think that is a point that we have to discuss in the discussion. For example, today here is here with us Alessandro Mantovani del Fatto Quotidiano, che appunto lui si è trovato durante la pandemia a dover scrivere di salute, quindi poi sarebbe anche interessante sentire il suo punto di vista. I think that you don't need to be a scientist to think critically and ask good questions about research. In the same way, for example, you don't need to be a politician to do smart political reporting. But science is complicated, and journalists would benefit from an education in the basics of study design and research methods, so the basic principle of evidence-based medicine, come diceva anche Camilla and Steven prima. One last point. I talk about I and Andrea talked about the challenges science journalists face in Italy, but I think that is not just an Italian problem. In these days, with Camilla, Raffaele, and Fabio, we are going to investigate how journals in the rest of the world treated the article that came out in Nature Medicine in February about the effect of COVID-19 on cardiovascular disease. And we focused on high-income countries and selected our sample through Almetric. And at the first look, it seems that the situation is similar, with low-quality science reporting. The only difference that we notice is that among the newspapers what have published a news about the study in Italy, there were almost all the major Italian newspapers. On the contrary, newspapers such as New York Times or El País, Le Monde, The Guardian, chose not to talk about it, not to publish about this study. Maybe because they consider it less relevant. And while other newspapers, like the Washington Post, mentioned the results, but putting them in a broader frame. So I think it's not only a matter of how to talk about science, but also a matter of if to talk about it.